We will be taking questions throughout the webinar, and we ask that you chat in your questions, and we'll set aside time to answer them at the end of today's webinar. For those LMSWs and LMHCs interested in obtaining CEUs, you'll be eligible to obtain 1.5 CEUs for attending this webinar. Information regarding obtaining the CEUs will be sent out shortly after the webinar's completion. Finally, towards the end of the webinar, we'll be sending out a feedback survey using the chat box functionality. We ask that you click the link that is shared in the chat box and complete the feedback survey. We appreciate you filling this out, as it allows us to understand your experience and enhance our future TTAC offerings. With that, I want to thank you all for joining us and hand it over to our partner, Evelyn Blank, Executive Director at the New York Center for Child Development and Director of TTAC, who will walk us through a brief introduction before our presenter begins. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ian, and welcome everyone. And wanted to let people know that today's webinar, Foundational and Key Concept Principles and Practices of Infant and Early Childhood Mental Health, is really meant as an introduction for the beginning practitioner, an overview for anyone who touches the lives of young children, and a refresher for more seasoned clinicians. Before we get started, I just wanted to briefly say who we are for those who haven't joined us previously. The New York City Early Childhood Mental Health Training and Technical Assistance Center, otherwise known as TTAC, is funded by the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, DOHMH. TTAC is a partnership between the New York Center for Child Development and the McSilver Institute on Poverty Policy and Research. New York Center for Child Development has been a major provider of early childhood mental health services in New York, and we have expertise in informing policy and supporting the field of early childhood mental health, both through training and direct practice. NYU McSilver Institute for Poverty Policy and Research houses the PeerTAC and the Community and Managed Care Technical Assistance Centers, otherwise known as CTAC and MTAC, which offer clinic, business, and system transformation support statewide to all behavioral health providers. TTAC is tasked with building the capacity and the competencies of mental health and early childhood professionals through ongoing training and technical assistance. And below is a link to our website. And if we go to the next slide, we have a screenshot of our website. And I wanted to let all our participants know that we do archive all of our presentations, both the recordings of the PowerPoint themselves. So we would encourage you to go to the website, which really has a rich resource of other provided opportunities to learn and to grow together. So I also just wanted to go to the next, where we've just recently released 2 LMS learning modules. The first module in the series is the impact of early childhood adversity, which is an overview. And the second module in the series is nurturing resilience, supporting infant and early childhood mental health. And just to let everyone know that CEUs are available upon completion. So it is now my privilege to introduce our presenter today, Dr. Gilbert Foley, who's an esteemed colleague and has been one of my own mentors here. He is the clinical co-director for the Training and Technical Assistance Center at the New York Center for Child Development, consulting clinical psychologist at New York Center for over 20 years, where he serves on the advisory board, and also Professor Emeritus Graduate Program in Infant Mental Health and Developmental Practice at Adelphi University. He is a retired tenured faculty member of the Furkhoff Graduate School of Psychology, where he taught for 20 years in the Department of School Clinical Child Psychology and coordinated the Infancy Early Childhood track. He was director of a federally funded training and technical assistance project that prepared infant and early childhood professionals across the nation. He is the author of several books and numerous articles, including Mental Health and Early Intervention, which he co-authored with Jane Hockman, and Linking Sensory Integration and Mental Health, Nurturing Self-Regulation in Infants and Young Children, which he co-authored with Susan Stallings-Saylor. And I just want to let you know that if you go to our website, and we'll put this in the chat, that you can access the webinar that they did on the presentation, and also a book club where they answered questions from participants in the audience. Dr. Foley consults and lectures widely. So it's now my pleasure to turn it over to Dr. Foley.
Thank you, Evelyn. It really is a pleasure to be here, and good afternoon to colleagues. It's always a delight for us to share ideas and to share times. This actual webinar today really is a refresher course. Many of you, of course, know all these ideas, and not only know them, many of you will practice them every day. So think of it as a kind of hopefully lively refresher. It was a refresher for me to compile the information. And the presentation basically has three components to it. We'll begin by looking at the core principles of development in general, and that is a key concept here, which I will address. As a result of taking it, you should be able to identify some of these core principles, as well as to define what we mean by infant and early childhood mental health, as well as to describe the components of infant and early childhood mental health, and then to illustrate some of the key practices of infant and early childhood mental health from your own experience. So I will introduce the ideas, but you really are doing it. You're living it, you're working it, and to begin to put some of these ideas together. So just to set a kind of philosophical tone for this morning, child development really is the bedrock foundation and first principle of infant and early childhood mental health. We can't think about the mental life, we can't think about the inner life, we can't think about the psyche without thinking about the body, without thinking about all of the domains of development. And so hearing the voice of my dear colleague, Serena Weider, nothing in development stands alone. Everything is related to everything else. And one of the big errors we are often, we all fall into the trap of sometimes substituting the part for the whole. And so we really need to embrace complexity as much as possible and try to understand as many variables that go into the development itself, as well as the presentation of any symptom complex. So let's look at some of these important principles that guide us in our work and our thinking. That development progresses in a gene-environment interplay and is largely experience dependent. I think we really have enough data now that we don't any longer talk about nature or nurture. It is always nature and nurture. They are co-determinants in development. And so they're always working in a kind of interactive, transactional kind of way. Think about temperament. These are inborn characteristics, right? The feisty, the flexible, and the shy child. But those inborn traits set off a whole cascade of environmental interactions, how we respond to those traits, those that we find easy, those that we find difficult. So it's always nature and nurture as co-determining. And of course, culture is a pervasive shaping force. I think we hear so much more about the cultural influences. And so we always have to look at development at large in that kind of a broad cultural context. So again, it is nature and nurture as co-determinants of this amazing process that we call development. Now, a very overarching principle is that development progresses in predictable patterns, right? If development were a totally random process, we wouldn't have a science of human development, right? We couldn't measure it, we couldn't track it, it would be disorderly, but it's not disorderly. One of the important things, though, I think, in terms of shifting ideas, is we know that development is orderly, but it's organically orderly. It is not a lockstep process. So we're really moving more and more away from stage and phase of the concepts. That doesn't mean that there aren't certain themes that don't take center stage at certain parts of development. But it really is a flexible process. One of the ways I like to think of it is if you would take an analogy of human development as a vine. It is an organic process, and how the vine starts from a kind of common core, and then it differentiates into multiple tendrils. And let's think of those as the lines of development. And let's say they're climbing up a wall, and they're climbing up a trellis. And let's think of the trellis as the spectrum of so-called mental health. And what we know, for example, is that some of those vines, some of those tendrils can stray off of what we would consider to be the sphere of typical development, but they can grow back in. And that's what we mean by thinking more about pathways of development, and that development is an organic process in which all of the lines of development are intimately and inextricably interlaced and in constant resonance with each other, right? Motor development doesn't happen in isolation from relational development, for example. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So we really have to try as best we can to wrap our minds about this complex array of interacting and transacting forces. Now, we also know that development progresses, motor development, for example, broadly from head to toe and from the center of the body to the periphery of the body or the hands. And people often say, now, why are these principles important? Well, they inform practice. So let's just think a little bit about this one, head to toe, center to proximity. Well, often we deal with children who may have low tone, poor stability at the core, right, or at the shoulder girdle. It makes sense that their fine motor development is going to be weak and wobbly, right? And sometimes, yes, we start with hand over hand, but don't start out here without thinking about what's going on here, what's going up the trunk, what's going up the spine, how much stability is there at the shoulders. And so here again, how these kinds of principles can give us clues about where to intervene, how to intervene, and where to look. So just as motor development proceeds from head to toe, neurological development proceeds from bottom up, cerebellum to prefrontal lobes. And in general, development proceeds from undifferentiated to more discrete kinds of skill acquisition, self-centered to other-centered, concrete to abstract, which gives us a very broad brush picture about how we're going to organize intervention, right? That we are really going to recognize that the child is self-centered and the child views the world from their own perspective. And we need to take that into account as we begin to intervene. Development further in its movement toward greater differentiation and complexity. We know that capacities also move from concrete toward abstraction, toward symbolization and skill refinement. And an idea that I think is so important, that I find so important in my thinking, is that higher level complex skills tend to be synthesized out of the components of lower level simpler skills. And this is why if a child has too many developmental gaps lower, they're simply not going to have the skill repertoire on which to borrow and which to rely to build higher level skills. So what do we mean by that very concretely? Well, I think you know that, for example, we talk about functional play. Functional play involves a lot of combination of objects. If you don't have good integration of two sides of the body, and you can't use those two sides in coordination, how are you going to combine objects? So here again, a motor skill is impacting what's going to be a play skill. We know, for example, pre-linguistic skills provide a very powerful platform for production. We're so concerned about language production. Of course, we want children to talk. But if they don't have receptive language, if they don't have comprehension, if they don't have shared attention, shared ideas, shared intentionality, expressive language is going to, again, not be building on the kind of solid foundation that we would like. So we really look at lower level skills and how they provide a kind of a repertoire of capacities that we draw upon to develop more complex skills. Also remembering that this miraculous unfolding of this, our human organism, of course, it's not a linear or even progress. It tends to happen in fits and spurts, plateaus and regressions. And don't forget about regressions. Regressions aren't necessarily always bad. There are times when we sometimes fall back, in other words, to spring forward, as Barry Brazelton used to say. We fall back to mobilize our resources, to regain our developmental momentum. And we optimize those times, and then they sometimes set the stage for what will be another burst in development. And, you know, Winnicott used to say, regressions are an opportunity. They're an opportunity to revisit the past. They're an opportunity to revisit where there may have been less than optimal conditions. And we can revisit them in the hope of repairing them. So they can be a developmental opportunity. And we need to understand the context, the timing, etc. I talked about this before, but I talk about it a lot, how all of the lines of development are inextricably interlaced in an interdependent way. A strength in one domain creates a strength in another. One domain builds on the other and impacts on all the others. And as a very young and very green psychologist, I happen to have had a federal grant. It was probably a little bit more than I could chew really at the time I had it. It was a wonderful opportunity, and it happened to fall on my lap. Sometimes we have that good fortune. But one of the things we did in this grant was to go around the country and train people in the transdisciplinary approach. And we would actually go into sites and do an arena evaluation with our team and the visiting team. And we worked with a real child right there in vivo. And I will never forget, as one of the tools in those days that we used as a broad-based sample of behavior, so that all of the disciplines could look at a common core of behaviors and then begin to look at the relationships, et cetera, was the Cattell Infant Intelligence Scale. And one of the items on the scale, I don't know, it was maybe about 10 months, something like that. You would get the child curious in a toy, like a squeak toy, and it had a little bit of a sadistic edge. Now, then you'd put a glass barrier in front of it. Well, it really was a very revealing item. Could the child retrieve the toy? Could they come up with an alternate motor plan to get the toy? Could they persist in their motivation? What was their frustration tolerance like? Well, I will never forget this little boy, delightful kid. He wanted that squeak toy. There was no lack of motivation, but he had one response. And that response was at the midline of the body to push at the glass. That really wasn't going to work very well. Now, was this a cognitive problem? Could this child not mobilize and solve the problem of the glass? Or was something else at work? Well, it turns out the fact we were working in an arena that my physical therapy colleague who was watching realized that this child had such poor stability at the center of the body and balance that he couldn't laterally flex in order to reach around the glass. Because had he laterally flexed, he probably would have lost his balance and had to prop with his hand. So she came over and gave him a little stability at the hips and at the bottom of the shoulder girdle. Boom, right around the glass and got the toy. That really left a lasting impression on me that this was not a cognitive. This kid knew how to solve it, but his body wasn't going to let him do it. So here we had a motor problem now, transacting and constricting this child's capacity to use what he knew, right? So again, we're always looking at these connections. Important idea, I think, for all of us. Of course, development is both continuous and discontinuous. What do we mean by that? Early experiences are, there's no question, early experience is important. First experiences have a kind of primacy about them. We tend to remember first experiences, right? First love, first kiss, first trip to the zoo, first birthday party. And of course, when these things happen young, we have a relatively virgin central nervous system. So these early experiences are being encoded in a relatively virgin nervous system. So I do think there's no question they have a primacy. But I think we now know that early experience isn't a fixed template. Yes, it sets a tone, but there's a lot of opportunity for change, a lot of opportunity for growth and turnarounds and new trajectories for better or for worse. And of course, that's why we all do what we do, isn't it? If it were all signed, sealed, and delivered by biology, well, there'd be no need for us. or the wonderful things, of course, that parents do. And we, by providing these environmental experiences, understanding the biological contributions, provide the opportunity for some of these dramatic changes in trajectory that can occur, and make it occur for better or for worse. For example, we know a child with a secure attachment who goes through a very acrimonious divorce can wind up with a different classification, an anxious one. We've also seen children who have a diagnosis, for example, possibly on the spectrum, who later in their development, as a result of wonderful parenting and intervention, are declassified. So we know that plasticity is the norm and change is possible. Development is relationship dependent. Now, this is an idea that weaves itself throughout this morning. And back to that very paradigm shifting little statement that Winnicott made in the 50s, there is no such thing as a baby, there's only a baby in some. Because we as humans are the most helpless organisms, the most dependent mammals for the longest period of time. And that in fact, I guess, is why we have such a big brain. It's really the price we pay for having a big brain, is that we have this long developmental period for our biology to form. But that also gives us a long period of vulnerability, doesn't it? And this is why relationships are so critical for our literal physical survival, because a baby, if I can put it bluntly, without a loving caregiver is a dead baby. And not only physical survival, but the capacity to thrive. So we know relationships are key. We know that the baby is wired right from birth to start to have interaction with their caregivers, so that we know that relationships are two-way from birth. They're not equal, of course. The child can't do as much of the work as the parent. The parent must do all of the work, but the child has inborn patterns of action and reaction that really are powerful signals and get this relational machine going right from the moment of birth. And we will visit this topic again, in its most basic sense, attachment has survival meaning, because it is by being in proximity of an adult caregiver that our survival is guaranteed. And we know that a secure attachment is the single best buffer against toxic stress. And that a secure attachment, in turn, is most apt to be formed in a relationship that is characterized by emotional availability, sensitivity, that is responsive, that is reliable, and that is benevolent. And it is those qualities that are the catalysts of a secure attachment. Remember that early care impacts the formation of brain architecture and epigenetics. And although this is an old kind of snapshot, the literature holds up that the picture of securely attached children that emerges is a very positive one. They are curious, self-confident about managing cognitive tasks, persistence in the face of frustration, and cooperative. Now, we know a secure attachment's not a guarantee, but it is a heck of a good and powerful protective factor for every child to have. We know that development is shaped by play, learning, and mastery. Play is what children do. It's their natural medium of learning. It's their natural medium of expression. And therefore, we want to seize it as an incredible opportunity. And I think we all know, play as we know it is imperiled. Children aren't out there. Well, then we had the pandemic. They're now out there exploring the world, exploring objects. Too much of it is two-dimensional, too quickly. Certainly the screen is a two-dimensional phenomenon. Children need to interact with objects in a tangible, three-dimensional way. They need to heft the object in order to know it. They have to feel it. They have to feel it in their muscles and joints. They have to look at it. They have to taste it. And so play affords this kind of an immersion in a sensory world that really affords opportunities for new possibilities. Play is a source of resourcefulness. And what to me is so beautiful, it all happens without the need for an imposed task. You provide the materials. You don't even have to provide many. Children will find their own materials in play. So let's seize this opportunity. It is also a dress rehearsal for life. Children play out roles, right? Mommies, daddies, policemen, fire chief, doctors, whatever. They're really, again, in playful imagination that anticipates future roles enacted with toys and costumes in tales and games. Learning is key. Learning is the capacity for adaptation is acquired largely through learning. And when I think about early learning with typical children and with children with special needs, I just can never give enough humble praise. First to parents who provide an environment for the child to survive and to thrive. And then for teachers, a great deal of respect for early educators and early special educators, because, of all of the professionals, you're the ones who really are called upon to be the generalists. You're the ones that are called upon to look at the full spectrum of development and to think about how all the parts fit together to make a whole. You're the ones who are tasked with preparing an environment that optimizes the capacity for learn, that sparks curiosity in children. And a big part of your job as educators is to consider what experiences are important for a particular child. With what frequency are those experiences optimal? With what intensity and timing should those experiences be introduced to facilitate learning? So it's a very key and very important job. And I also want to underline that in our work as parents and caregivers and as teachers, don't forget the activities of daily living. Eating, sleeping, toileting, hand washing, diaper changing, all of those that seem like menial tasks are really naturalistic developmental opportunities, affordances, if you will, to interact with the child, to engage them, to talk about them, to introduce a toy, and of course, to use yourself, your affect, and your experience to interact. Very, very important medium. And I say that so that we pinch ourselves and not let some of these routine activities of daily life not get too routine, not get too automatic or so automatic that we forget to capitalize on them and to maximize. And remember that individual differences are more the norm than the exception. Each child is uniquely different, and each child is entitled to be uniquely understood. Well, with that as a kind of foundation for development itself, we can't teach a course in development. That would be of a magnitude beyond the few minutes we have today. But I do want to kind of give you a quick glimpse, what I call early development in a gasp. And I'm going to rely on the wonderful work of my colleagues, the late Stan Greenspan and Serena Weider, who have formulated the functional emotional developmental capacities. Now, they are deceptively simple. They really are highly distilled aspects of development that pare development down into these 9 very important core capacities. And I've always thought, if you know these, you know a lot about development. Obviously, they're not the whole, but they're kind of I think of them as an elegant, parsimonious axis that tells us a lot in a little. a lot and a little, not unlike poetry. And remember, good science is always parsimonious. So I think of these as the stepping stones on the pathways of development that we attempt to ascend. I'll quickly go through them. Level 1 in the birth to freedom month, a basic physiological regulation, an ability to be in the alert state, to get asleep, patterns of eating and sleeping, and of shared attention. Now remember, shared attention is dyadic. That's the ability to relate to one other person back and forth. Joint attention is triadic. When a child and an adult, let's say a parent or a teacher, are reading a book. So we are both attuned to a third thing. Think of it as a triangle, and think of shared attention as a dyadic. Mutual engagement, which of course really begins at birth, but begins to be elaborated in that 2 to 5 months with attachment at its core. Intentional two-way purposeful communication, again, starting at birth, largely reflex mediated then, but increasingly becoming more complex and more intentional, and key to not only relational development, but the development of language. A complex problem solving starting at about 10 to 18 months, starting out very simply of how we get our needs met. How do we re-engage a parent, a loved one, when there's been a rupture? How do we, when there's been the normal disruptions in relationships? And we know that's that work of Tronick and Brazelton, that about 60% of the time, actually, parents and babies are out of sync. So it's not so unusual. And I often wonder whether Mother Nature and development itself hasn't prepared it that way. So we learn how to repair ruptures, because I think it's really in repairing ruptures that is the art of relational development. And again, Mother Nature may have built that in, so we get ample practice on how to repair. So key to future development. And then it goes on to other forms of complex problem solving. Level 5, of course, is when we now finally enter into the symbolic world, when we've had enough experience from the world around us. We have assimilated, we've gotten and taken in enough information about experience in the world that it begins to be encoded in our mind. It begins to be mentalized. And now we can enact it increasingly from the inside out, as well as from the outside in. Abstract thinking by level 7 now. By level 6, we begin now to become more abstract. We begin to see relationships between ideas. We begin to have logical sequences in our ideas. Our play tales and our verbal tales start to have beginnings, middles, and ends. By about 7, we then move into multi-causal triangular thinking. This really starts to parallels Piaget's conservation, principles of conservation. This is when the child can begin to act on what they know rather than what they perceive. And that requires, again, an ability to leap beyond the literal and start looking at multiple factors. Level 8 and 9 in adolescence, beginning to have comparative gray area thinking, moving beyond everything being white, black, all or none. And then eventually moving into reflective thinking, where we can examine ourselves. We have a growing sense of who we are and beginning to have internal stabilized standards of conduct and ethical principles. So let's just look. I'm going to lump the first 4 levels together in this wonderful little video of Fiona. Now she's 12 months, but I think this videotape sheds tremendous light. Look at her regulation, how well she stays regulated. Look at the level of her shared attention with her mom, the engagement, and the kinds of two-way communication. And I think this is such a powerful tape. I really got to this through my good colleague, Sima Gerber, a speech-language pathologist, who's taught me so much about all that goes on linguistically before the child even says a word. Now, she may have a word or two, but not much more than that. But I want you to watch at the complexity of her conversational give and take, the two-way back and forth that goes on, and the level of her intensity in relating to her mother. And then the problem solving here is not that complex, but it's beginning, it's early, because you're going to see she's trying to get her needs met. She wants more bubbles. And let's look at how all of these foundational 4 levels are beautifully expressed in Fiona's lovely interaction with her mother. Keep your eyes on, again, regulation, her ability to engage, to be communicative without words, and to find a way to have her needs met.
I do more? 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 What? Oh, more? Hi. Good to hear that. Okay. Hi. Hey, Daddy. Want your cup? Look. My cup. Plop, plop. Plop, plop. What? Hi. You want his hand? Bubble, 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 bubble. Bubble, bubble, bubble. Ooh, the water. That's like a wall. Plop. Plop. Plop.
Well, I think you can see that little Fiona is pretty competent and very skilled in relating and communicating, getting her needs met, and how much she's learning from the interaction, the tremendous use of self that the mother demonstrates, and just the water, the bubbles, and the cup. You don't need a lot if we think about how to use ourselves and really build on what the child tells us. Level 5, the child now moves into symbolic thinking and language, beginning to see the relationship between emotional states and behavior. It starts early with representational play, where the child starts to play with experiences that they themselves have had. So the child in their play does in their play what's been done to them. So you might expect when Fiona gets into this stage, she's going to probably be quite interested about giving her baby dolls a bath, for example, and feeding them. And that would be the beginning of representational play, which then blossoms into full-blown symbolic play toward later in this period, where the child now, of course, goes beyond these concrete uses of objects and themes and starts now to have imagination, pretends and builds on ideas and combines them. They're no longer so dependent on miniature objects, props. They can now start to make believe a block is a car, a banana is a phone. And eventually, of course, they can start to generate ideas and play themes right out of their head without the need for so many props. The play starts to have a socio-dramatic quality, the deepening of a plot, a theme, and the play may have roles and rules, which is also a way in which the child is starting now to learn about social conformity and a sense of order. And then level 6 is where the child now starts to begin to build bridges between ideas. The thinking becomes more abstract. Their proto-play and language narratives now start to have a beginning and a middle and an end. The child can start to connect ideas, very early. The child puts the kids on the bus goes to school, but oh my goodness, there's a flat tire on the way to school. We now have to get the repair people in, and thus we see this complexifying lines of a plot and narrative, and beginning to see an internal logic and internal sequences. So again, the functional, emotional, developmental levels. So with that developmental primer, and indeed a quick one, let's now look at infant and early childhood mental health. What do we mean by it? And what are some of the key practices that define infant and early childhood mental health? So let's look at the definition itself. The 0 to 3 one is one that is a pretty standard one, and I think a good one. It is the infant and early childhood's ability and capacity from birth to 6 to do what? To experience, regulate, and express emotions. So we know that the affective piece is a key core of infant and early childhood mental health. And when we talk about having a full array of emotions, that also includes negative ones, because they're a part of life and they've got to be learned to be dealt with as well. I think a key factor here is to regulate, and we'll talk about that a little. The ability to form close and secure interpersonal relationships. That attachment is absolutely foundational, and it sets a tone for a lot of what will come later, and gives the child an anchor in which to go into the world and explore and learn, because we know environmental exploration is key to learning. And all of this occurs in the context of family, community, and cultural expectations. So again, the key clusters then are having an affective array, a robust and full one, the ability to regulate them, the ability to form significant attachments and relationships, the ability to explore the environment and learn. And again, all of that is immersed in a cultural bath. And we sometimes say that infant and early childhood mental health is synonymous with healthy social and emotional development. But again, I don't want to disembody that from moving, thinking, experiencing sensorily, learning, because again, they're intimately interrelated. And that's why, as mental health professionals, we need to know the rest of development, and why many of the other developmental specialists need to also to know something about emotional and mental health development as well. What is infant and early childhood mental health as a practice? What we just said before is what it is as a concept. This is what it is as a practice. It is a body of knowledge, principles, and strategies that have been derived from multiple disciplines, because infant and early childhood mental health is a multidisciplinary, if not transdisciplinary, specialty. And again, it is relationally formed and aimed to, one, promote the optimal self-social emotional development in infants and young children. So our first aim is promotion, dissemination, helping every child to have a positive start in life. It is aimed to prevent developmental derailment, and then to intervene and nurture derailed development if in fact that has occurred, with a range of mental health and developmental experiences. Promote, prevent, and intervene. Just a little quick, we know that social, emotional, or sometimes thought of as non-cognitive skills are so key. They're not secondary. They're really right there with other aspects of learning. And we have a growing body of strong empirical evidence that suggests social emotional development synonymous with infant mental health, sometimes referred to as non-cognitive skills, formed early in life, are pivotal in increasing the likelihood of healthy personal development, future success in the workplace and adult well-being. And there have been any number of longitudinal studies. One came out not so long ago. They followed a group of kids from kindergarten through into their 20s. And they were looking at what might be the best predictors of future success. Now, there were certainly multiple ones, but the one that was the most powerful predictor were these children's assessment and appraisal of their pro-social skills in kindergarten. That was the strongest predictor. So social emotional skills are not minor. They're not minor. They're very powerful. And they cast a long shadow, for good or not so good, on the course of development. Now, if we go back and look at those primary clusters that form the core of what is infant and early childhood mental health, we said the ability to experience a full range of emotions, but also to regulate them. Regulation is very key because, emotions that are unregulated are unbridled, and unbridled emotions set us up for trouble, right? So when we think about self-regulation, this is the definition that my colleague Susan Stalling-Saylor and I have used in the book that Evelyn mentioned. Self-regulation is the child's developing capacity. Developing is the operative word, to flexibly modulate and grade, not just to have all or none levels of affective arousal, but to have a range, a spectrum, if you will, of affective and arousal states. Again, the ability to flexibly modulate and grade reactivity to arousal, physiological arousal, sensation, emotion, and behavior relative to context, right? We adapt our levels of affect and arousal to meet the demands of a particular environment. So we know that, being at a rock concert is a different level of arousal than being at church or synagogue, for example. So we have to learn to do that. It is the ability to recover from dysregulated states. No one is regulated all the time, including us, including me, right? We all have times when we get a little bit out of shape, and we've got to get ourselves back to baseline. So the ability to recover is important. And that's one of the things why I always say, you don't want young kids to be too good all of the time. They have to learn how to practice getting from a state when they're a little overreactive or having a meltdown, how to get back into that regulated state. And it's the ability to sustain adaptive levels of arousal with increasingly relative autonomy in support of goal-directed actions across a broad range of functions. So regulation is important. I do just want to say to those of us who are mental health professionals, we're very focused on emotion regulation and very important. But one of the things that I think more and more the literature and the clinical experience is showing us is that emotion regulation very early is closely tied to the regulation of arousal and affect. And so we really want to look at the capacity, again, how these underlying skills can provide a foundation for the regulation of emotion, which is a much more abstract kind of idea. And, emotion regulation starts to become, of course, children have affective states very early, but they become differentiated from sensation and physiological arousal around 18 months when the child has the capacity to be self-observing and can begin to label affective states. And let's not forget in emotion regulation, the attention to the messages we get from the inside of our body, what our OT colleagues call the interoceptors, what respiration, what our gut is telling us, our heart rate, all of that are powerful antecedents of what is emotion. And so helping children to know what's happening in their body is an important way to learn to regulate emotions. And of course, it's in our common parlance. Wow, we're red with rage. We have butterflies in our stomach. So we know that physiological bodily states have a lot to do with what will become emotion regulation. One theorist says emotion is interoceptive inference, that we infer our emotional state from what our internal body states are telling us. Just an idea that regulation is a developmental process. It starts out with external regulation. In a newborn, we have to provide almost all of the support to keep that baby calm, to keep that baby warm, right? And then through the most of the preschool years, it's really a process of co-regulation. A lot of what parents do and what we do and what teachers do is to co-regulate the preschool child, incrementally stepping back the amount of co-regulation we give them so they can internalize and develop some of their own self-regulatory capacity. And children really aren't even at the threshold of self-regulation until 4 or 5. So just remember, we sometimes expect too much too soon. Here's again why developmental expectation and knowing developmental norms is very, very important, so that we have expectations that are really appropriate. So back to the second component of early childhood mental health, it is relationship-based, and back to attachment is the key concept. Of course, children learn to have relationships with those outside of the attachment system, but that attachment system is pivotal. And what is attachment? At its most fundamental, it has survival meaning. It was probably formed in us. It has an evolutionary base. We're hardwired to form attachments. And Bowlby talked about it very simply. He said, attachment has survival meaning because if you're in a dangerous situation, and remember, infancy is a dangerous situation because of our relative helplessness, your chances in that dangerous situation of survival are vastly increased if you're with a responsive, reliable, and competent companion than if you're alone. And it's as simple as that, at its most basic. Out of this attachment relationship that has survival meaning, in which infants are active participants in their own attachment, by the way, because they come with this incredible array of inborn patterns of action and reaction, face gazing, social smiling, sucking, and grasping, and all of those are signals that bring us into proximity with the baby. And out of that loving effort to co-regulate our infants and young children, an enduring emotional tie forms to a particular set of individuals. And that is the emotional side of attachment. So I think of it as having two sides of the same coin. Survival meaning, out of which, by guaranteeing the survival of the baby and being available to that child in a way that is sensitive, we read the signals, we respond to the signals, we do it with relative consistency, and we do it benevolently. Out of that then comes this enduring emotional tie, which is the other side of the attachment. Survival on one side, enduring emotional tie on the other. And remember that the attachment figures continue to serve an important role as a secure base, as an anchor that gives the child the confidence and the security to go out in the world and learn and explore. And that out of our early experiences, we begin to internalize a core set of expectations about what is possible in relationships and by being a part of a relationship. Bowlby called this our internal working model. Again, why the power of first experiences lay down some of these expectations. There are various types of attachment qualities. We don't have time to go into them. The secure, which is, of course, we want every child to have a secure attachment. This is where the child feels safe and assured. The anxious avoidant one is one where a child really is too self-sufficient. And that can be a little deceiving We want all our children to be self-sufficient, but true self-sufficiency comes out of a base of dependency and security. If the child is being asked to be too self-sufficient too soon, then they really may learn to be avoidant. They may feel like they have to take care of themselves prematurely, and that will eventually backfire. The anxious ambivalent attachment is one where the caregiving was probably sometimes there and sometimes not. The reliability part wasn't very good. And these are often children who have struggles with issues about approach and avoidance. And then the most pathological form, these are styles. They're risks. They're not in of themselves pathologies, but the disorganized attachment is. This is where children have an unsystematic and confused pattern of relating. And it may arise from a situation where children are put in a terrible bind. The terrible bind is when the very people they should be looking to for safety and security are also the people who sometimes do harm. And this is where exposure to the adverse childhood experiences, early trauma, can enter its picture. And Evelyn mentioned that on our website, we have a lot of wonderful webinars, and I would encourage you in the attachment area to look at one by Judith Solomon. Judith, actually, with the late Mary Main, was the identifier of disorganized attachment and was a Bowlby Award recipient. So I would encourage you to look at her webinar if you want to dive a little more deeply into attachment. Again, exploring the environment and learn is the third component of infant and early childhood mental health, remembering that knowledge is constructed. It's constructed from experience. It's constructed from sensory experiences, exploration, discovery, and mastery of the environment. And all of this occurs within that context of culture, which influences every aspect of the parenting relationship. It impacts the goals and expectations we have for children. We know, for example, some anthropologists, I'm very wary of these broad brush kinds of categories, but look at some cultures that are interdependent and those that are more autonomous oriented. And I think you could say in an interdependent culture, the goals for children will be slightly different. There'll be much more emphasis on nurture and taking care of each other. And you would expect in those cultures that weaning might come later, that co-sleeping might be much more normative, because we want children to feel very much a part of the group, as opposed to cultures more like ours, where we want children to be more autonomous and a bit more self-sufficient. Expressions of love, every culture has ways of expressing love to children, but they may be different. Some cultures are much more demonstrative than others. In some cultures, food, for example, plays a big role in expressing love. And then obviously different approaches to discipline. Some cultures are very permissive early on, up to a point, and then they start imposing more socialization and enculturation. So all of these basic components of what is infant and early childhood mental health must be understood through this powerful lens. Now, from looking at those basic principles, I know I'm moving fast. Let's look at some of the practices that kind of flow out of the principles. Remember, principles and theories and research are important because they give us the ground out of which then we develop what we do and how we do it. So again, probably the most fundamental is that infant and early childhood mental health is a relationship-based practice. I want to remind you of one of Sally's provinces, Beaumont. Don't just do something. Don't just act. Stand there and pay attention. And it really speaks to how being emotionally available and having an attuned presence is so powerfully therapeutic. Never underestimate just the fact that you're there, just the fact that you're lending your full consciousness to this child and this parent. And what a gift that is to be heard and to be known in a unique way. Think about our working alliance with the family. How that is really the anchor that sustains the intervention relationship. And remember that we want a working alliance in which there is positive regard for the client. We are there in an authentic and an open way. And the working alliance, I like to think of it simply. It's a way of saying to a parent, I'm pulling in the same direction. We're pulling in the same direction. It doesn't mean we might not disagree. That may not mean there won't be bumps on the road, but basically I'm an ally. And when the going gets rough, let's go back to that core relationship to help us see our way through it. We treat to the relationship itself. We know pathology can exist in the parent, it can exist in the child, but we know it also can exist in what goes on between and among. And so we treat to the interaction, to that goodness of fit between parent and child. And in this process, concrete services and supplies go a very long way. And there are times when we have to be there for parents in a very real way, finding them housing, finding the preschool, helping them get diapers. And I really would refer you to we have some wonderful webinars by Arietta Slade, and she illustrates some of this so beautifully. And I would refer you to those to kind of really give you a more elaborate look at the relational foundations. In infant and early childhood mental health, we watch, we wonder, and we listen deeply. Watching is so key when we're dealing particularly with young children who may not always be that verbal and whose play skills may not yet be that developed. So some of their most powerful channels for communicating may not yet be fully formed, but we watch. That doesn't mean we don't get it wrong, but baby watching, is so critical. And what does that trigger in us? What associations do we have? And we listen very deeply. And so this is a good place, I think, to take a little bit of what I call an interlude for the senses and the spirit. And I want you to watch this little baby listening for the first time. It's visual, it's on a screen, but listening to Luciano Pavarotti singing Nessun Dorma, that incredibly emotional aria from Turandot, which really means none shall sleep, because it is as if in a dream of wish and fear, of imminent danger and of hope. And so watch this little baby. Watch this baby's attention. Watch the baby's face. It appears that this child is totally attuned to the affect. And then a little later on, watch the baby's feet. And also note, think about attachment, that throughout this powerful experience, the child references what I think is his mother any number of times. Secure base behavior. watch, wonder, listen deeply. You know, my mentor, Sally Province, also was one to say, the child will always tell you. It may be in code, but it's our job to decode it. Look how expressive that child was. The affect of attunement was, I think, remarkable. In infant and early childhood mental health, we make no perceived assumptions about the family. We monitor judgments. That doesn't mean we may not go in with concerns. There may have been a report of abuse, but we start with a fair, level playing field. We wait for the family also to tell us, and we monitor our own countertransference reactions so that we can know that family and that child in a unique way. We start with the assumption that parents know their child best until proven otherwise. And that means in infant mental health, we make ourselves the learner. And we ask parents to teach us about their baby. And we do it with humility, and we do it with respect. We find and support the strengths in the parental-child relationship. We find the good in the parent-child relationship. Because you're not going to go anywhere starting with criticism and starting with finding the flaws. That's not going to be a very good port of entry. And, you know, a person who also had a great influence on me, the late Rebecca Shamoun-Shelnick, many of you may know her, I'm sure you do. She's been such a voice, positive voice in our field. But she had a remarkable way of talking with parents. And I remember one time listening to her with a family where the family had been a little, I won't say abusive, but they were a little unduly harsh in their disciplinary methods. And I remember Rebecca saying, after listening carefully to this, you know, what I can hear is how much you care about your child's future. You really want your child to do well and not to wind up in jail, as so many maybe others in your community have. And you're trying to keep your child on the even path, right? But maybe there's another way to do it. I hear your concern and your deep love of your child, but maybe there's another way to do that, and we can figure that out together than the ways you're doing it now. So even in circumstances like that, we reach for the good intent in order to form that alliance and to try to effect a positive change. We believe in infant mental health, that parenthood itself is a developmental process. I don't think we talk enough about that. I think it's such an important message for us to hold on to, particularly when the going gets rough. Parenthood, as we know, is characterized by new challenges, new developmental tasks, vulnerabilities, but also enormous developmental affordances for personal growth, learning of new skills, experiencing new forms of satisfaction and fulfillment, and even providing an opportunity to repair relational and developmental failures and losses from the parent's own past. So we believe that parenthood can grow and it can change. And I think it helps keep us doing the work, even when the work is very hard. We support parents. We respect their concerns and their priorities. And when possible, we address them. And we impart skills that strengthen the parental capacities, that magnify their ability and capacity for reflective function, and to amplify parental feelings of efficacy and satisfaction. Just recently, I was working with a parent of a young child on the spectrum, and the parent's greatest concerns were about the child's behavior at the table. Well, okay, that might not be our first concern, but that's what's important to the parents, and that's where we begin. And you know, you can do a lot of working developmentally appropriately in that, thinking about for the parent, how is the child positioned? Is the child, are their feet dangling? Are their feet on a supporting surface? Might that increase their attention at table, for example? Thinking about their fine motor skills and their motor planning. How might that impact their ability to be available at dinner time and be a little more in tune with what's going on? So often, again, the parents' concerns are, again, a way to deal with other developmental issues while at the same time meeting the parent where they are, starting with what the parent finds to be their concerns. I had a very, very telling experience years ago when I had the opportunity to do reflective supervision at Bellevue. We had, this was in a former wave of homelessness. There were a lot of shelters in the area of Bellevue. And we had a grant to start parent-infant programs in the shelters. And it was a wonderful experience. And we'd go in at least once a week in each shelter that we were assigned, and we would set up like a mini opportunity for parents and children to play together with a special educator, a social worker, and an assistant. And when we started, we found that we would start with parents and babies on the floor together, playing together. And we found that a lot of our parents were having a hard time playing with their baby. They would, in some cases, get in what almost looked like competition with their baby, in competition with their baby for the toys, for the attention of the adults. And we learned we had to meet the parents' needs too. We had to nurture the parent so they could nurture the child. We changed the model. We would have the parents come in with a baby, play on the floor together a little bit, and then we would separate them in eye shot of the baby, so that, of course, the babies could go and refuel if they had to. But we would take the parents and put them at tables, and we would put some of the same toys out at the table that their children were going to be playing with. And the parents would play with the toys and have an opportunity to talk. And after they had had that experience, we would reunite them with their children down on the mats. And the nature of the play was very, very different. We didn't see that same level of competition. They were much more cooperative, much able to be there playing with their children. And so again, the importance of meeting the parents' needs and nurturing the parent so they can nurture their child. Infant and early childhood, again, is an affect-focused, intersubjective model. We feel with parents and child as individuals, as a family. And we also recognize that parents may be grieving the loss of the hoped-for child themselves if this is a child with some diagnosable disability. And we are attuned, and we feel with what might be motivating parental behavior and what is their subjective experience. And we try to attune ourselves to it, coordinate ourselves with it, not as a merger. We remain as separate people, but it is a source of tremendous power. And some of you may have been familiar with the Boston Change Group, a group of analysts who got together to try to look at what are the mutative factors in psychodynamic psychotherapy. And they boiled it down to intersubjectivity, that ability to experience what the client is experiencing and being with them, not as a merged object, but as a new object, but one that is in resonance with their inner life. And also in infant and early childhood mental health, we too must learn to tolerate ambivalence. Tolerating ambivalence is a very, very important part of what it is to be a parent and what it is to be a therapist, right? Not everything goes well all of the time. And sometimes we have negative feelings about our clients, about ourselves. And we have to live with that ambiguity and remain regulated in the face of strong feelings. That's a very, very important part of our work. And when I say all of us on the team need to be mental health informed, that is one dimension I'm talking about. We all have to deal with our own inner states and the kinds of emotional states that the work evokes. It's hard work. You all know that. This is terribly hard work. It doesn't look so hard. Often it looks like fun. We're playing with babies and parents. What could be more fun? But it's evocative work. It's provocative work. And it requires an enormous amount of emotional energy if we're to be there, not only physically, but also affectively. In our work, we attempt to find an optimal professional distance. Now, this means that thinking of our professional not as an absolute. Now, sometimes we're closer, sometimes we're a little more remote. We have a range, and we are neither so close as to distort our judgment or compromise the self-sufficiency of the family, nor are we so distant and coldly clinical as to prevent our feeling with the family and providing empathic support. Finding that right place and realizing that it is changing and that we often need then to be attuned to what's happening in the family to know when we need to give more support, when we can back off. Here again, just as we talked about co-regulation with the child, in a way, a lot of our work is co-regulating the parents and the family as well, so they can be available to their child. We recognize that the way we relate to and treat the parent and child has the power to shape the way the parents relate to one another and treat their own child. We call that parallel process. It's a little more than just modeling. It has to do with a consistent way of being available. It means that when there's chaos, we come with a calm peace, and we cope with the chaos by staying regulated and beginning to offer the parent a new object, a new experience, and a new way of being. And very often you'll see the parents start to model us, start to do some of the things that we do with our own child. Thinking about the late Cherie Paul, who said, "Do unto others as you would have others do unto others." And thus the parallel process is a kind of wonderful positive ripple effect that goes through the family and hopefully is a subtle but powerful form of learning and change. Remember that infant and early childhood mental health has always been trauma-informed. It has always been trauma-informed. They go right back to that work, The Ghosts in the Nursery by Selma Freiberg and her colleague Shapiro. That is in the canon. That was really about trauma. Now, it was about projected trauma, right? The trauma of the parents that was reenacted and reactivated in the course of the relationship. And so infant mental health has always had an awareness for trauma. But now we're also addressing more clearly experiential trauma, not just projected trauma. Traumas that have been very real and recurring in the life of the parent or the child. And I'm not going to talk about infant and early childhood mental health as a trauma-informed practice, but it is, because there's so much being talked about now. And I refer you to the webinars that Joy Osowski and Jerry Costa did during the pandemic about looking at experiential trauma and how we have to attune ourselves to that and come to understand how that has a powerful and often insidious impact on the child and the family, and why we need to be trauma-informed. Also pointing out that we look not only at the traumas, but we look at the angels, as actually Carla Poole and I think, talked about that early, but we didn't elaborate. And then Alicia, of course, gave a beautiful look at how the angels, we build on the good. It's back to build on the good. We draw what has worked well as what hasn't worked in the life of the parents. And we use that to emotionally refuel and motivate and help the parents to know that they have capacities. It's a can-do approach by looking at those aspects of our own histories that were positive. We sometimes speak for baby, a powerful technique, a way often to say difficult things to the parent in a way that is less threatening, as if the baby were saying to mom, you know, mom, I need you right now. I can't get myself calm or quiet. You're important in my life. And finally, we know that infant and early childhood mental health is reflective practice through reflective supervision. Reflective supervision is a key form of learning, a key form of cognitive learning, but also emotional learning that weaves itself throughout infant and early childhood mental health. It's kind of hand in glove, knowing that how you are is as important as what you do. Through reflective supervision, which is a relationship for learning, a relationship for learning, and I refer to the work again of Rebecca Shaman-Shanak and Linda Gilkerson, who did some of the early work in reflective supervision. It's a process by which we allow ourselves to be in touch with our own feelings and recognize how they impact us and how they impact the way we work. Reflective supervision is a powerful process through which we transform impulse and reaction to mindful responsiveness and a way of refining perceptive problem solving. These are some of the aims of reflective supervision. It is through self-observation in reflective supervision that promotes self-monitoring and a pervasive attitude of mindfulness. It is by reflecting on the work that we become better able to reflect in the work. So, a lot of information, but I hope leaving you with key ideas that you live every day and that you do every day. And I want you to leave here with a sense of how important you are and how important the work that we do is. It is life-changing work, and it is work that mobilizes all the forces of development on behalf of children, families, and their futures. Thank you.
Gil, thank you so much. That was such a comprehensive and integrated overview of child development and infant mental health. And we will take questions in a moment, but there's just been a ton of accolades in the chat box to the panelists here. And the main thing is asking for the PowerPoint, which will be posted on our website along with the recording of this presentation, so that it'll be there and be there for your colleagues if you really want to go back and review again. And also just to say that Dr. Foley had referenced in his presentation several previous webinars that had been done by TTAC. Nicole did put them in the chat box with the links, but if you go to ttacny.org, you can find all the resources and go to training, and you'll be able to access all of them. So thank you for joining us. There was one question I'm going to pose. Person said, I've experienced hearing people talk about infants with secure attachment. Is an attachment related to how a toddler responds to separation from the secure base figure?
A very good point, yes. And we know that still the gold standard is the Ainsworth-Strange situation, which is an experimental technique in which the child and parent are in a playroom with a stranger, and the child at one point leaves, well, the parent leaves, and of course we observe very much how the child responds to the parent leaving. Are they anxious? They should be somewhat anxious. They should miss the parent. Or are they nonplussed? That also tells you something. And so separation is a marker that we look at. to tell us something about the quality of the relationship, but almost even more important, what happens when the caregiver returns? How does the child greet that caregiver, that loved one? Do they welcome them with open arms? Do they use them for support? Do they seek some emotional refueling? And then when they're ready, can the parent let them down, go off and play? Or do they avoid the parent when they come back? Or do they approach the parent and then withdraw? Each of those tells us something. So you're absolutely so correct. Separation is a powerful marker and it is a communicator. And we look at both separation and reunions as being very, very telling.
So thank you so much. We're almost at the end of our time here. I did want people to please take a moment to fill out the feedback evaluation. We just put it in the chat box there and very much value your feedback in terms of planning future events and trainings. So thank you so much, Dr. Foley. This has been so powerful, and I know that people will be referring back to it, and it's just been terrific. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you, everyone. Good to be with all of you wonderful colleagues.